you have any idea that you were related to her?
No, but look at our hairstyles. They're very much alike.
Long before scientists opened 2 unremarkable vials in a quiet Edinburgh lab, a different story had already been unfolding in silence, carried from mother to daughter through generations that never knew its origin. That story would surface only when a forgotten signature in the cell awakened a history the record books had buried, revealing a truth no royal biography had ever dared to include. The unexpected discovery. When the samples arrived at the University of Edinburgh in 2013, the researchers expected nothing more than a routine verification of aristocratic lineage, since mitochondrial DNA tests had become a standard tool for tracing maternal ancestry across long historical timelines. The 2 saliva vials belonged to women descended directly from Princess Diana's maternal line, and their unbroken sequence of mothers made the samples ideal for a clean, uninterrupted genetic profile that should have aligned neatly with centuries of documented Spencer history. The team processed the samples with the usual precision, layering quality checks over each stage of sequencing, yet the emerging data resisted every assumption the lab had carried into the project. The mitochondrial markers appeared in combinations so geographically improbable that the analysts repeated the run multiple times, convinced that equipment calibration or human error had introduced a distortion into the results. As the data stabilized, the scientists realized they were staring at a signature that defied any known European lineage, since the haplogroup they identified had previously appeared only in a handful of individuals from India and Nepal, with no historical presence in the British Isles at all. The contradiction between documented genealogies and empirical evidence grew sharper with each confirmation, pushing the research out of routine analysis and into an unfolding historical puzzle that demanded a closer search for the lineage's missing ancestor, the woman the records tried to bury. The search for the missing ancestor led historians back to Surat, a port city whose dense markets, multilingual streets, and constant maritime traffic created an environment where cultural boundaries blurred more easily than colonial authorities preferred to acknowledge. It was here, around 1790, that Eliza Kawark entered the historical landscape through scattered records and later through the letters that preserved fragments of her voice. Her mixed Armenian-Indian heritage allowed her to move within several communities, yet it simultaneously placed her at a disadvantage within the rigid hierarchies of British India, where ancestry often dictated one's social mobility, legal standing, and even the legitimacy of family ties. When she became the household companion of Scottish merchant Theodore Forbes, their relationship developed into a partnership that functioned privately as a family, although the surrounding society refused to recognize it as such. They lived together in Surat and later in Mocha, where his East India Company duties required fluent navigation of diplomatic and commercial networks that benefited from Eliza's linguistic range and familiarity with the region. Despite this shared domestic world, a legal framework shaped by colonial anxieties hung over their lives, because the 1791 Bengal Regulation 8 automatically classified mixed heritage children of British fathers as illegitimate, regardless of paternal acknowledgement. The regulation reflected a broader campaign to discourage cross-cultural unions by ensuring that children of such relationships could not inherit property, status, or formal recognition. This policy supplied both the mechanism and justification for later genealogical erasures, since it allowed families to exclude women like Eliza and children like Catherine from official narratives without contradicting legal precedents. Understanding this context reveals why her lineage could vanish so thoroughly from Spencer family records, even though personal correspondence showed she had been central to the household Forbes built abroad. Letters across an empire. The deeper researchers moved into the archival record, the more Eliza's life emerged through the fragile letters she sent after Theodore's relocation to Bombay, each written under circumstances shaped by expectations that left little room for women of her background to assert their rights. These letters, dictated in imperfect English to a Parsi scribe and signed in Armenian script, revealed a woman attempting to maintain a connection to a family already slipping beyond her reach. While Theodore navigated the drawing rooms and commercial networks of a society that rewarded conformity to British racial boundaries, Eliza remained in Surat with their children, increasingly aware that the social fabric surrounding them was tightening in ways that would eventually separate them. The tone of her correspondence reflected both dignity and distress, since she understood that decisions made in distant colonial offices could determine whether she would ever again see the daughter she had raised from infancy. Each letter carried a request, shaped by the emotional tension of a mother negotiating for time she was no longer certain she possessed, because Catherine was being prepared for a life in Scotland that would sever nearly all ties to her birthplace. After Theodore's death at sea in 1820, the distance between Eliza and her children transformed from geographical separation into a form of institutional silence, as guardians executed legal instructions that reduced her to the role of a domestic employee. Catherine sailed for Britain under the supervision of others, while Eliza's final appeals remained unanswered in the household where they had once lived as a family. The eventual discovery of these letters in a drawer at Boynley House illuminated not only her determination, but also the structural forces that prevented her story from entering the genealogical narrative preserved by subsequent generations. 2 centuries of genealogical redaction. By the time Catherine settled into life in Scotland, the conditions that allowed her mother's identity to fade from the historical record had already begun taking shape within the broader culture of Victorian Britain, where aristocratic families treated lineage as both a social credential and a political resource. Genealogies were curated with deliberate attention to reputation, meaning that anything perceived as inconsistent with prevailing ideas of racial hierarchy or class propriety could be quietly removed without leaving an obvious trace. Eliza's background, shaped by the diverse communities of Surat, conflicted with these expectations, and the combination of her mixed heritage and her connection to a colonial relationship made her particularly vulnerable to omission. Over time, successive family historians relied on selective interpretation of surviving documents, emphasizing an Armenian origin while overlooking or deliberately excluding references that pointed toward South Asian ancestry. Printed peerage records, marriage registries, and privately circulated family histories reinforced this sanitized version of events, which grew more entrenched with each generation that accepted the revised narrative as fact. Social pressure encouraged families to align their histories with the image of cultural purity valued by British high society, especially during the 19th century, when the empire's expansion heightened anxieties about racial boundaries. By the 20th century, the fictionalized genealogy had become so normalized that it appeared uncontested in biographies, official documents, and even in materials circulated during major public events. When Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, the Spencer lineage presented to the world contained no suggestion of the South Asian ancestry, hidden behind layers of respectful omissions and careful redactions. The persistence of this version illustrates how historical memory can be shaped less by dramatic concealment than by generations of quiet editorial choices. The royal bloodlines they couldn't hide. While Victorian genealogists succeeded in reshaping the public memory of Eliza Kewark, they were unable to obscure another dimension of the Spencer lineage, since the family's connections to the English monarchy were so deeply interwoven with centuries of informal relationships at court that the historical record simply contained too many points of verification to suppress. Long before Princess Diana became a global figure, her ancestry had been threaded through the illegitimate descendants of multiple royal households, particularly those associated with the expansive family network of King Charles II, whose numerous acknowledged children with influential mistresses positioned branches of his lineage across the upper tiers of British aristocracy. As these lines merged through successive marriages, the Spencers accumulated ties not only to the Restoration Court, but also to earlier dynastic histories, including a direct line to Mary, Queen of Scots, whose turbulent political legacy shaped the succession crises of the 16th century. This intricate network of descent meant that Diana entered public life with a pedigree that, according to Burke's peerage, surpassed the royal lineage she married into when she wed Prince Charles, whose immediate ancestry had been shaped more recently by continental houses such as Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The revelation that Diana carried a concentration of historical royal bloodlines, while simultaneously descending from a woman erased from official family memory, underscored the contradictory forces shaping aristocratic identity. Her genealogy embodied both the prestige families sought to highlight and the heritage they felt pressured to conceal, creating a portrait of lineage in which celebrated connections coexisted with deliberate omissions. This duality set the stage for understanding why the mitochondrial discovery carried implications far greater than a single corrected record, since it revealed how complex and selectively curated the story of British royalty had always been. The genetic thread reaches the crown. Once researchers identified the rare R30b mitochondrial signature, they began mapping its journey across the generations that linked Eliza Kawark to the modern royal family, revealing a continuous maternal thread that survived despite every attempt to obscure its origin. Because mitochondrial DNA transfers exclusively from mother to child without recombination, each woman in this lineage carried an identical molecular record of ancestry, meaning that no social convention, legal framework, or genealogical revision could sever the biological continuity that stretched from a port city in Gujarat to the upper echelons of British aristocracy. As this inheritance passed from Catherine Forbes through successive daughters, the genetic marker remained dormant in public awareness, yet fully active within the cells of each descendant, ultimately reaching Princess Diana and then her son, Prince William, whose future reign has drawn global attention to the symbolic weight of this discovery. The presence of this South Asian lineage does not alter the constitutional structure of the monarchy, yet it carries cultural and historical significance for a commonwealth shaped by centuries of uneven relationships between Britain and the regions once governed under imperial rule. It also highlights an emotional dimension, since William represents the final generation able to carry this maternal lineage forward, although his children cannot inherit the mtDNA that connects him to Eliza. The approaching end of this genetic thread deepens the poignancy of the discovery because it underscores how a legacy once erased from written history persists only briefly in the biological record, reminding us that ancestry can survive silence yet remains vulnerable to time. Eliza's story shows how erased lives can return to reshape the narratives we inherit, reminding us that ancestry holds truths written beyond official history. If you want more documentaries that uncover what the record books overlook, subscribe, share this story, and join the search for what else has been buried.